few days before ESPN anchor Jemele Hill tweeted that the president is, quote, a white supremacist and that his rise is, quote, a direct result of white supremacy, she shared on her Facebook page Ta-Nehisi Coates' widely talked about piece in The Atlantic titled The First White President, in which Coates writes, "It is often said that Trump has no real ideology, which is not true. His ideology is white supremacy and all its truculent and sanctimonious power. In Trump, he states white supremacists see one of their own." Joining me now is Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose Atlantic piece was excerpted from his forthcoming book, We Were 8 Years in Power, which people should read if, for no other reason than to find the source of that quote, which is chilling and unnerving. One of my favorite things in the book. Good to have you here.
Good to be here, man.
So I want to start on the Jemele Hill thing just because I think it literally directly relates. Like, I think she was reading your article, and I'm not saying that this came from you, but she posted your article, and she says this thing which, you know, we were joking about the fact that if you publish this on the cover of one of the oldest magazines in America, you get, you know, people running to debate it, but if you tweet it and you're, you know, Jemele Hill, then you might get in trouble.
Right. I don't know what ESPN's policy is, you know, in terms of politics. So I can't speak to the appropriateness of, you know, what happened with her. But I can speak to the offense taking, for instance, of Sarah Huckabee Sanders and now, you know, Donald Trump himself. I mean, this is characterized, as I said, in all of its truculent, you know, sanctimonious power. This is what white supremacists tend to do, going back to the days of slaveholders who insisted that, in fact, the North was trying to subjugate them and turn them into actual slaves. It's always the white supremacist who's being offended. It's always him that something's being done to. So I think it's, you know, pretty characteristic in our form.
I want to talk about that term white supremacist in a second, but first, just lay out, there's the conceit of the piece, which is that Donald Trump is the first white president, is a really gripping one. What's the basic idea? Well,
I wanted to attack the basic notion that whiteness is ultimately about phenotype, that race is an actual real thing, biologically inherited thing, instead of, as the great historian Nell Painter says, actually an idea, not a real thing, in fact. And so whiteness actually has to, you know, come from a certain place. And throughout American history, what it's come from is the negation of blackness, the idea of not being, a word I can't say here on all, which is actually in the essay. And one of the fascinating things about Trump is not so much that, you know, he you know, has a history of racism, has a history of being a white supremacist. We've had other white presidents who are just like that. Obviously, we've had other white presidents who checked white on the on their census form. But we've never had a president who so much defined himself by the president that was before him, who just so happens to be our first black president. My argument in the piece is, in fact, you can't actually have a white president, the idea of a white president, without having a black president before him, much just as you cannot have a white America in this country without having a black America.
You say the ideology is white supremacy, and you use this term white supremacist. You used it here. It's the one that Jemele Hill used as well. And I want to make an argument for why that brings people up short, which I think you know, right? But
I do.
You know, that is a term that a lot of work has gone into creating a taboo around, sort of rightly, I think, right? So the conception in sort of common parlance is that is someone who wears a you know, Klan robe, a person who proudly proclaims their belief in the inferiority of non-white people. You're using it in a much more expansive sense. What is that doing? Why are you doing that?
Well, I think if you own a business that attempts to keep black people from renting from you, if you are reported to say that you don't want black people counting your money, if you say, you know, and not even reported, just come out and say someone can't judge your case because they're Mexican, if your response to the first black president is that they weren't born in this country, despite all proof, if you say they weren't smart enough to go to Harvard Law School and demand to see their grades, if that's the essence of your entire political identity, you might be a white supremacist. It's just possible. I mean, I'm willing to have that debate and hear the other side, but you might be. And I think with Donald Trump, it's quite a bit. For instance, I wouldn't say George Bush is a white supremacist. Now, I have a lot of problems with George Bush's policies. I can make an argument for how they, you know, affect black people in a negative way. You know what I mean? But I wouldn't argue that he's a white supremacist. I wouldn't argue that Mitt Romney is a white supremacist. Donald Trump is a particular, specific thing, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence to back up the charge.
In terms of the essential core of what he is doing,
I don't think he's president without it. I think that's the huge difference. It's not a side, you know, it's not like Bush 1, for instance, with Willie Horton, which was bad, by the way, right? But not necessarily definition. It's just a thing I got to do in order to get over. It's the core of him. He began his career in birtherism. It wasn't on the way. That was the thing that got it started. That was what kicked it off. And so I think in that sense, he's different.
There's a real question I think about sometimes about Trump, and I think about Ross Perot.
Right.
And here's why I think about it. I remember living through the Ross Perot phenomenon and thinking and there was all these think pieces that like the two-party system is broken apart forever. This is a transformational moment in American politics. Nothing will ever be the same.
Right.
And then it turned out that he would just be an answer to a trivia question.
Right.
Like there was no Perot-ism.
Right.
It was a sui generis phenomenon, right? And I wonder sometimes about Trump which of the two paths lay before us.
Right.
Like, is he this transformational sort of hinge in American history about the appeal of particularly white nationalism, front and center, or will he be relegated to a kind of footnote?
I don't know. I hope it's the latter. The argument for the former, though, is in fact that, as much as I say, Trump is different, he actually is, though, the culmination of a certain path that the Republican Party chose, from Nixon on, and particularly chose in how it interacted with Obama over the last 8 years, which says he has actual roots in something, that, this is not a military junta, that this says something about the base of the Republican Party, about the people who actually cast the votes, and that argues for something more. Listen, my great fear, Chris, is that someone more competent, someone who better understands Washington will look at Trump and figure out and say, oh, this is what I got to do. This is what I can get away with. That I think is the great, is a really, really scary thing that could come out of this.
So I want to talk about the sort of the cause of the Trump win in sort of relationship to your article. Right? Because I think one of the things you talk about in the article, and you have sort of section where you talk about this sort of obsession with the white working class, particularly, and you sort of lay out this case of like, the reason Trump's president is white people, because he won every category of it, right? So it's like he won them geographically, he won them by income, he won them by education level, by gender, et cetera. But there's this part that struck out to me, right? You say Trump won white women +9 and white men +31. And then you say he won white people with college degrees +3 and white people without them 37. And I read that in the piece when you're making this point about like, let's just think about this as whiteness. But I saw that difference between 3 and 37 and my mind was like, well, there's something going on there.
There is something going on there.
There's something like this obsession with the white working class or white non-college as it's called. And like there is a numerical basis for that, right?
There is, but what I always say is that there is, or what I've been saying, is that there is a tendency to pay attention to one adjective more than the other. As I argue in the piece, white people in this country, or the white working class in this country in terms of their votes, are not remarkable in terms of their working classness, but in terms of their whiteness. That's what puts them in league with everybody else. You're right. Yeah, more white working class people went for him. But black working class people didn't go for him at all. Latino working class people didn't go for him. I mean, obviously some did, but the majority didn't. You don't see that same sort of. It's the whiteness that's similar across the board, that goes across class, that goes across gender, that goes across education. That's what's different. So the argument is not that, among some, certain group of, white people, you can't find more supporters. Yeah, that's definitely true. But what's the thing that's most common? And the sad thing is it's the whiteness. That's what's most common, not the workingness. Not the fact of being a member of the working class.
There's this question about the sort of Obama-Trump voter. And that is a kind of, people say this all the time when you're making, I know, you're shaking your head already. I want you to respond to that, because I think actually you get some interesting terrain there. Stick around.
Okay.
More with Ta-Nehisi Coates after this break.